Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on the roots of Latinx history. And first, I want to clarify that I'm not going to be going over all of the reading in detail. I'm just going to highlight certain aspects that I want to make sure that you are aware of and highlight certain key points. Areas that I don't discuss in the lecture, of course, you can bring them up during our discussion posts. And some of those areas that will be in the reading, but that you might not see in the lecture, are also subject to appearing in any of your exams. So it is important that even with these detailed lectures that you do the reading every week for the class. So starting this week, where we're talking about the roots of Latinx history, we really have to go back quite a while to really understand the relationship between the United States and Latin America from early on. That actually goes back to colonization, where this part of the world was being colonized by both the British and the Spanish. And so understanding that history helps us understand what is going on today between Latin America and the United States and Latinx populations in the US. So our story begins with indigenous populations of the United States, the settlement of the English in the US, and the settlement of the Spanish in Latin America. Now, the first reading talks about the differences between British colonization and Spanish colonization, and understanding their different strategies and philosophies around colonizing indigenous people helps us understand some of the different attitudes around issues of race, land, and so on that are still with us today. So for the British, they sought to conquer, occupy, and possess the lands of the quote unquote heathens and infidels. In other words, they defined indigenous people as outside of the Christian, outside of Christianity. And so they justified their conquest because of this. If they were outside of Christianity, then they were subject to conquest. English colonies began as family settlements, ensuring the segregation and the limitation of miscegenation. Among the English, there was no one church, like the Catholic Church is for the Spanish, that held the same kind of unifying and dominating power. So there are multiple religious beliefs and practices that the British settlers bring with them. The Spanish philosophy was different. It was conquered through conversion. So they didn't see the indigenous population as a population to sort of keep away from, but they saw them as a population to incorporate through the conversion of them into Catholicism. So the Spanish, following the Catholic Church and the dictates of the Pope, sought to conquer through conversion. The indigenous people who did not succumb to their diseases or to the abusive labor conditions or to the violence of war were to be assimilated through Christianity. Baptism, in a sense, cleansed them of their otherness. And so this allowed the Spanish conquerors to then take on indigenous women as concubines, right? So it wasn't unclean for them to be with indigenous women or take them on as wives because now they were Catholic. So as soon as they were converted, it was okay for them to then mix with the indigenous population, whereas for the British, mixing was not allowed at all. The Spanish conquest was dominated by men and the church, unlike with the British, as we said, they came as families. So on the one hand, you had more opportunity and reason for there to be mixture between the indigenous and Spanish populations. And on the other hand, you had the church missionaries who saw the indigenous people as salvageable and thus went into the communities instead of staying away from them. The reading also discusses the many missions created by Spanish priests throughout the new colonies and the dominance of the Catholic Church. the centers of every town, the most dominant structure was the church. And here is an example that demonstrates how this influence of Catholicism is still with us today. The top photo is the Plaza de Colón in the town of Mayagüez, Puerto Rico, which is where my family is from. And you see the same kind of structure where in these town centers called plazas, on one side of the plaza, there will be the Catholic Church, and the other side would be sort of the city hall or whatever the governing structure was at that time. And so this setup you still find throughout Latin America and in the southwestern United States. So the bottom photo is Old Town Plaza in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And here's the church, San Felipe de Neri Church, which was built in the early 1700s. So you still see this in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The reading also talked about the role of race, the different ideas around race that each empire had. So in the British colonies, the one-drop rule was kind of the way of understanding race. So if you had one drop of any non-white race in your heritage, then you were considered a part of that race. Slave marriages are not recognized, families were separated, and free persons of color were an anomaly. In Spain, there had already been a long history of racial mixture due to the long period of Arab domination in the region. But tolerance for racial mixing did not mean racial equality. There were still clear demarcations among those that were elite and in power and white, and slaves, laborers, or servants who were of darker skin. Racial interactions were still dictated by values of the Catholic Church around issues of marriage and family. Another distinction between the two made possible by the dominance of the Catholic Church was that slaves in Latin America were allowed to marry, and the church would not permit married slaves to be separated as was done in the English colonies. Whereas free persons of color in English colonies were an abnormality, and the one-drop rule made you Black above anything else. In the Spanish colonies, particularly after the Haitian Revolution, opportunities for slaves to be freed were made available, resulting in a much larger population of free persons of color. So this sort of explains the difference in sort of the racial demographics that we find early on in the colonies versus the colonies of the Spanish. The reading also talked about different philosophies around land. To the British, land was an investment to buy and sell. To the Spanish, land was an inheritance to pass on to your family and ensure wealth for generations. There were also different political structures existing already in the United States and in Latin America that kind of fit with the political structures of Spain and England. So the Spanish superimposed their governing structures onto existing indigenous structures. And one example that the reading talked about was the Aztec structure, where there was a particular ruler who ruled over all of the people, among which caste differences existed. The English brought their traditions of common law, local control, representative government, but it also worked here because the Iroquois Confederation existed and already had a very similar governing structure, so they could kind of superimpose that onto an existing structure. The image depicts Hiawatha, the Iroquois leader, who is believed to have brought the idea of Iroquois Confederacy and democracy. Now, when we switch to the reading of the textbook, Crucible of Struggle, the frame of reference of colonial history is from Mexico, where the North is the frontier. So in American history, whenever we talk about the frontier, we're talking about the West and the movement west. From Mexico's perspective, the frontier was the North, right? And the northern areas of the country that were difficult to manage. So here we have a map of 1810, and all the yellow areas demonstrate areas that are ruled by the Spanish Empire. You can see the United States of America at this time is significantly smaller compares to all of the area that the Spanish oversee, and that at this time is called New Spain. Now, there are a number of challenges for the Spanish Empire for overseeing this northern frontier. Managing such a vast amount of land was a challenge. There was resistance from indigenous groups against subjugation. And as you saw in that map, it's a very large chunk of land with numerous different indigenous groups already on them. Threats from other empires like the emerging United States was another challenge. And the eventual discontent among Spanish criollos, criollos means people of Spanish ancestry who were born in the New World, with distant Spanish rule and economic neglect. Now, the way that the northern frontier was governed by the Spanish Empire was through two specific institutions: Spanish missions and presidios. The Spanish missions are really the religious kind of side of the governing structure, which focuses on subjugation and assimilation of the indigenous peoples and use of corporal punishment to subdue resistance. Presidios was the more military institution, which consisted of military installations meant to protect the Spanish-owned lands from indigenous populations that are surrounding and that are resisting, right, their encroaching and taking over of land. These, however, were poorly staffed and neglected by the central government of New Spain, which is found in Mexico City at this point. Now, a way that the Spanish Empire thought they could maintain more control over this northern frontier was by encouraging Spanish settlers to settle in that northern area with promises of land, titles of nobility, wealth, and military protection. This meant to increase the Spanish buffer between populations. The northern frontier also provided opportunities for mixed race populations to gain status and wealth otherwise denied to them in other parts of New Spain, including remaking their racial identities. So they were able to purchase certificates of whiteness so that they could then move to the northern frontier and take advantage of all of these benefits that were being given to new settlers. And this is an image of what the presidios and the missions look like. On the right, you have what the missions look like. You see sort of more of a church-like kind of structure. And the presidio is an example on the left, which you see more of looking almost like a fort. Now, in 1821, Mexico becomes independent from the Spanish. And so now you see in the map, all of those yellow areas are what Mexico is, the country of Mexico is in 1821. And you will see this significantly shrink as we get to the war between the US and Mexico that results in what is today the Southwest to become a part of the United States, which are those kind of northern areas that you see in the yellow area there. Now Mexico is in charge, right? It's a Mexican government that is in charge, but they still see those northern areas, what is today the US Southwest, as a challenge for governing because the central government is on the southern part, central and southern part of the country. So the government is centralized in Mexico City. These vast lands are challenged to control and govern. There is resistance by some of those frontier states to Mexico's controlling government. We also start seeing an interest by the United States in moving into those areas. And we also see a defiance of trade laws establishing economic networks with foreigners. So even though those northern parts are part of Mexico, they're a different country, they have to follow the trade laws of the Mexican government. Because they're so distant from where the center of government is happening, they start not following these rules, and is starting to establish trade and networks with the Americans that are next door because they're easier to get to them. Tensions with indigenous groups continued in the northern frontier even after Mexico takes over the government. And these indigenous groups didn't care that Mexico had gained its independence, and didn't recognize the Mexican government as their own government. Mexico's weakness at the end of the wars of independence also made it difficult for the government to offer incentives to these groups to become allies to the Mexican government. Tensions therefore continue between certain indigenous tribes, such as the Navajo and the Spanish-speaking settlers in New Mexico. Raids by indigenous groups continued as a result, whereas in Arizona, for example, the Mexican governor there promoted hunting Apaches for their scalps. Going against Mexico's war against the indigenous population at the local level in some areas like New Mexico, local Spanish-speaking populations made alliances with local indigenous groups like the Comanches. So when you look at the various different tribes, right, and how they related to Mexico, to Spanish settlers, you're not going to find sort of a general universal experience and decision. Each tribe sort of made their own decisions as to how they were going to relate to Mexico and its government, and to the Spanish settlers that were living amongst them. Now, what we start seeing as the reading demonstrates the histories in New Mexico, Texas, and California is how the United States starts becoming politically and economically invested in these areas that ultimately result and allow for the United States to win the US-Mexico War. So first in New Mexico, one of the key trade areas was the Santa Fe Trail. And Mexico, in an interest in expanding its economy, opens the Santa Fe Trail very soon after becoming independent. And so Americans start to filter into New Mexico, making cheap goods available to New Mexicans for trade. Land grants are made available to Anglo and French investors close to the trail to facilitate further trade. Trade with Americans raised the living standards of the wealthy in New Mexico, who then become dependent on trade with the Americans. So you start sort of this dependence of New Mexico from the US economy. But you also see moments of resistance throughout this early history. In New Mexico, when right-wing governors assigned, the governors would be assigned by Central Mexican government, the Mexican government appoints a governor in New Mexico who is very conservative. And makes New Mexico a department of Chihuahua instead of its own separate territory and limited local autonomy. New Mexicans revolt against Mexico. Governor Perez's centralized government control, heavy taxation, and compulsory militia service eventually met opposition from both rich and poor in New Mexico, leading to one of these revolts in 1837 known as the Chimayo Rebellion. Now, in this early history, it's kind of hard to find narratives about women, right? A lot of the early colonial history is about conquest, colonization, war, and tend typically to focus on the experiences of generals, soldiers, politicians, and so on. So I want, at different times, you're going to see me highlight some women's history that may not be found in your text. And this is one particular example of Doña Gertrudis Barceló, who was known at this time as La Tules. She moved to New Mexico following Mexican independence with her family. She married at the age of 23, which was unusual in that time period when women were married at a much younger age. When she married, she kept her dowry, her own property, and her maiden name, which again, these were unusual things for women in the early 1800s. She opened an illegal gambling hall catering to the soldiers and traders of the area. So she was located right on the Santa Fe Trail. So she was able to benefit from the movement of goods and soldiers and businessmen. And they were all the ones who basically attended to her various businesses, which included a hotel and a casino in Santa Fe. She was also known for being an astute car dealer and businesswoman, and she was often called the, quote, Mexican Queen of Sin. Now, from the Anglo perspective, she was considered a woman of ill repute by the Anglo-Americans that started settling in the area. Many of the negative depictions of her were written to explain why the U.S. had invaded Mexico later on, and that Doña Barceló represented the immoral nature of the Mexican population. So on the one hand, she is respected by the people that live in the area, that attend to her businesses, and is very well respected for being a very good businesswoman. She's the one in charge of financially taking care of her family. But from the American perspective, she is perceived as this immoral woman because she's doing all these things that are not considered ladylike or appropriate for women to participate in. And eventually the United States actually uses her as an example of what's wrong with the Mexican people and why they need to be colonized and subjugated. Now, Texas, of course, is a key part of this history because Texas was the first part of Mexico that becomes part of the United States in 1836. And there is a long history of how this process happens that gets us to 1836. And part of it was facilitated by Mexican laws that were created to actually encourage Anglos to settle in Texas, but also establish laws that they were supposed to follow in order to become citizens and members of Mexico as a country. So the 1824 colonization law allowed Anglos to settle in the eastern regions of Texas, where Mexico had very little presence. There were strict rules they had to abide by, including becoming Catholics and Mexican citizens, and abide by Mexican laws, including the prohibition of slave trade. But these rules weren't always enforced, which later on become part of the problem. The Mexican government also provided large land grants to Anglos to settle with Catholic families in Texas. The example of this is in Austin. The town of Austin is created by one of these settlers who buys this land grant and brings Anglo-Catholics to settle in that area. And so this creates the opportunity for alliances to be created between wealthy Tejanos like Juan Seguin, who's a very famous Mexican-American of this time period in Texas, and create alliances with Anglo settlers like in Austin. Assimilation of Anglos into Mexican culture and society was encouraged. And so this results in the Anglo population outnumbering the Mexican population by the 1820s. Now, in addition to these more legal ways of bringing Anglos into parts of Texas, there were also illegal ways in which Anglos were starting to encroach into Texas land. One of these were through the strategy called filibustering. And filibusters were bands of Anglo settlers who would occupy a territory or town and proclaim their own republic. The rebellions would then prompt the United States to send military backup to claim the surrounding territory. And so we begin to see this filibustering expeditions into Texas during this time, where Americans would seize lands owned by Tejanos, forcing Mexico to set up more military garrisons to try to quell the encroachment of Americans. And so this starts to create sort of this tension between the Tejanos or Mexicans in Texas that were already there and the Anglos that are starting to move in. Tejanos, who preferred the liberalism of the Texians, as Anglo-Texans begin to be called, to autocratic centralists ruled by Mexico, soon found themselves increasingly pulled toward opposing Mexican rule by declaring independence for Texas. So sometimes this history of the fight for independence for Texas gets presented as Anglo-Americans versus Mexico or Mexicans. And that is not necessarily the case, right? So you had wealthy Mexicans who did not like the rules of the central Mexican government, who were creating alliances with the new Anglo settlers in Texas. And together, were formulating more of this being in favor of independence for Texas from Mexico. One of the reasons for Texians clamoring for independence, though, was that they wanted slavery to be legalized in Texas. So you have different motivations for wanting Texas to become independent from Mexico. Other attempts to liberate Texas included Stephen Austin going to Mexico City to petition the government to make Texas a separate state of Mexico. Instead, he was arrested and kept for a year. The resistance by Texans to the central government escalates to the point of war and battles, ultimately leading to the Battle of the Alamo, which many of you may have heard of or remember from your American history textbooks. And there are two videos for you to watch that talk about the Battle of the Alamo and also what it means today or more contemporary times in Texas. Now, as I said, the Battle of the Alamo is sort of the battle that is known as the ultimate fight for independence for Texas. And in this battle, General Santa Anna's troops surround Texas revolutionaries who were in the Alamo mission, depicted there in the image. And because he refused to take any prisoners, the Texas soldiers that are basically trapped in this mission all end up getting killed. Anglo-Texans end up swearing revenge against Mexicans, and unfortunately didn't differentiate between Mexicans in Mexico and Mexicans in Texas. So you have at this point some of these racial tensions being created between Anglo-Texans and Mexican Texans. Texans eventually catch up to Santa Anna and attack him and his soldiers, and end up capturing Santa Anna and force him to sign a peace treaty granting Texas its independence. So this is how Texas becomes independent in 1836. Finally, we have the example of California. And in California, the population didn't have a strong sense of loyalty to Mexico. And had created kind of its own localized identity as Californios. After Mexican independence, Mexico opens the ports in California to foreign trade. Again, this is how you have New England traders arriving to California and kind of infiltrating the politics and economy there. That again ultimately allows for California to then become part of the United States. So New England traders infiltrate California society, marrying the daughters of prominent wealthy California families, becoming Mexican citizens, and pledging loyalty to the Catholic Church, and performing assimilation into Mexican society, only to later on help the United States take possession of California. So those same people that kind of come at this earlier point and say, we're here to be part of Mexico, to be basically assimilated into Mexican society, into the Catholic Church, those same people turn against them later on and facilitate California becoming a possession of the United States. The reading also discusses the prevalence of the California missions, their treatment and views of the indigenous population, ultimately believing that the indigenous population needed the Catholic Church because without the church, they will return to their quote-unquote pagan ways. Thus, indigenous people were perceived as unprepared for citizenship. Yet at the same time, we see the indigenous populations resisting, right, this philosophy, ideology, and encroachment onto their lands. The most prominent one being the rebellion in La Purísima mission, where 2,000 indigenous people took over the mission. And this was the Chumash Revolt of 1824. So this ends our lecture for this week. I look forward to seeing your thoughts and comments in the discussion post. Have a wonderful week.